I was stepping out of my truck when I saw them. Three barefoot kids standing in the dust, their clothes clinging like they'd been worn for weeks. The smallest girl took one step toward me, her lips trembling, and whispered, "Please, food." I didn't know it yet, but those two words were about to change everything. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the flat Texas horizon, bleeding streaks of gold and burnt orange into a sky that seemed almost too wide to contain them. Heat still clung to the asphalt even though the day was ending, and the air smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. Jake Pullman eased his aging Ford truck off Route 46 and into the cracked pavement lot of a gas station that had clearly seen better years. The faded sign flickered half-heartedly, one bulb buzzing like a dying insect. He cut the engine, and the truck gave a tired cough before settling into silence. That silence wasn't peaceful. It was the hollow kind that surrounds a man carrying more weight than he knows how to set down. Jake leaned forward, resting his forearms on the steering wheel for a moment, just breathing. His back ached from the long day. His stomach reminded him, with a low, twisting growl, that he hadn't eaten since sunrise. In the rearview mirror, his 5-year-old son, Ben, was slumped against the seatbelt, his small face softened by sleep. A lock of hair stuck damply to his forehead. Jake's heart tightened at the sight. This little boy trusted him completely, believed without question that Dad would keep them safe. That faith was a blessing, but tonight it felt like a heavy responsibility pressing against Jake's chest. 3 jobs lost in 6 months. Each one had promised a fresh start, a chance to claw their way back from the edge, and each one had slipped through his fingers like dry sand. The thought of failing Ben, of not being able to keep the lights on, put food on the table, gnawed at him in a way no hunger ever could. He'd been down before, but lately it felt like the road only tilted one way, and he was sliding faster every week. Jake rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, trying to push away the fog of exhaustion. He reached into the glove compartment and felt the familiar crinkle of the protein bar he'd been saving. Just one. He told himself he'd eat it after filling up the gas tank, something small to get him through until morning. But for now, he just sat there, the low light casting the truck's shadow long across the parking lot, feeling the weight of another day gone with nothing to show for it. He didn't yet know that in a few minutes, everything he thought he understood about hardship and about his own limits was about to change. Jake pushed the creaky door open, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been oiled in years. The evening heat wrapped around him the moment he stepped out, and he took a long stretch, his arms pulling against muscles that had been locked in the same position for hours. Gravel crunched under his boots as he straightened, squinting toward the far edge of the parking lot. That's when he saw them. 3 kids stood in a loose huddle near the cracked curb, their small bare feet shifting uncomfortably on the gritty pavement. Dust clung to their ankles, and their clothes looked as though they'd been worn too many days in a row. Thin shirts stretched at the seams, shorts frayed at the hems, colors faded to the memory of what they once were. The oldest, a boy maybe 10 or 11, stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his chin tipped up in a way that tried to say, "We don't need anything from you." His jaw was set, eyes scanning the lot like he was guarding the 2 younger girls beside him. One of the girls had a head of tangled blonde hair pulled back with a ribbon that had lost its sheen, the ends fraying like the threads on her shorts. She clutched the hand of the youngest, a little slip of a child whose eyes looked far older than her years, eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to sparkle. Jake slowed his steps, not wanting to startle them. His first thought was confusion. Kids this young, out here alone at this hour? His gaze swept the lot, looking for a parent. That's when he saw her. A woman stood a few feet behind them, tall, but with a frame that looked worn thin from more than just hard work. Her jeans were faded, the knees pale from repeated wear, and a plain tank top was knotted loosely at her waist. Her hair was pulled back, but strands had fallen loose, framing a face that seemed permanently etched with exhaustion. She wasn't fidgeting or pacing, just watching, eyes locked on her children with the kind of sharp, protective awareness that comes from having been forced to stand guard more times than you can count. Her gaze flicked toward Jake as he approached, measuring him, weighing whether he was a threat. And Jake, he knew that look. He'd seen it before, in mirrors, in the reflection of store windows when he was bone-tired and running on nothing but stubbornness. That silent armor people wore when they'd been hit one too many times by life and learned the hard way to expect nothing from anyone. Something tugged at him then. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Jake stood there for a moment, his boots rooted to the cracked pavement. The protein bar in his truck flashed in his mind, his one planned meal before morning. Logic told him to keep it. But logic was no match for the sight of those 3 children shifting under the weight of hunger. He walked back to the truck, pulled open the glove box, and took the bar in his hand. The wrapper crinkled loudly in the quiet evening. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it now carried a different purpose. When he turned toward them again, the boy, the self-appointed guardian, noticed him first. His shoulders stiffened, and he took a step forward, not out of aggression, but with the posture of someone prepared to stand between danger and the people he loved. His chin stayed high, but Jake could see the flicker of wariness in his eyes. Jake stopped a few paces away and crouched down so they were eye level. He kept his voice soft, careful not to make it sound like an order or a bribe. "Do you want food?" The smallest girl, still clutching her sister's hand, took a hesitant step forward. Her bare toes curled slightly against the warm asphalt as though the ground itself might take the offer away if she moved too quickly. Her lips trembled before she spoke, and the sound that came out was barely more than a whisper. "Please, food." It wasn't the word please that cracked something inside Jake. It was the way she said it, like she was trying to be polite about something that had nothing to do with politeness. Hunger didn't belong in a child's voice. Jake glanced toward the woman. She met his gaze without flinching, but her eyes told a story before she spoke. There was pride there, enough to keep her from asking outright, but beneath it, a raw desperation she could no longer hide. He asked gently, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Her answer came flat, without embellishment, as though she'd used up all her emotion surviving to this point. "We haven't eaten in almost 3 days." The words landed like stones in Jake's chest. 3 days. For him, skipping meals meant tightening the budget. For them, it was simply the reality of their lives. Her name was Clara. Jake learned it not because she introduced herself formally, but because it slipped out later, almost as if names had become less important than survival. They stood there for a moment in the dimming light, her children staying close to her legs as though they were the only shelter they had left. Clara's gaze drifted toward them often, checking that they were still within arm's reach, even as she began to speak. Her voice was low, even, the tone of someone telling a story she'd repeated too many times, not because she wanted to, but because sometimes people needed to know why you were the way you were. She'd been on the road for weeks, she said, moving from state to state, trying to keep ahead of the man she had once called her husband. He had been charming at first. Most men like him were. But the charm turned to control, and control turned to fear. When she finally gathered the courage to leave, she left with nothing but her kids and a half-tank of gas in a car that was already coughing toward its last mile. She'd abandoned the apartment without looking back. The job she'd held, gone overnight. The few friends she might have called for help were hours away, and she didn't even know if they'd answer. She had no phone anymore. The bill had gone unpaid. Her last cash had been spent on fuel and a bag of thrift store clothes, layers to wrap her kids in at night so the cold wouldn't creep into their bones while they slept in the car. The car now sat hidden behind an old diner at the edge of town, a place that had shut down months ago. Its cracked windows were boarded up, weeds pushing through the concrete lot. At night, she'd park in the shadows, hoping the darkness would keep them unseen. She tried to find work, walking into businesses and asking if they had anything at all. But without an address, without a phone, and with 3 children trailing behind her, the answer was always the same. "Sorry, we can't." What struck Jake wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was no self-pity, no performance to win his sympathy. She told it plainly, like she had learned long ago that begging rarely opened doors. She had kept going, not because she believed in miracles, but because quitting wasn't an option when you had 3 small reasons to keep breathing. Jake listened in silence, the edges of her story folding neatly into the frayed corners of his own. Jake didn't answer right away. Clara's words hung between them, heavy in the warm evening air. He kept his eyes on the ground for a moment, not because he didn't want to look at her, but because he needed to gather himself. Everything she had said pressed against something buried deep inside him, something he usually kept locked away. 2 years earlier, his life had shattered in a single phone call. A drunk driver. A rainy night. His wife gone before the paramedics even arrived. Since then, it had been just him and Ben, moving from one place to another in search of steady work. Every time he thought they'd found a foothold, it crumbled beneath them. He'd been a warehouse loader, a delivery driver, a construction laborer, whatever paid the bills. And yet here he was, jobless again, standing in a gas station lot with a woman and 3 children who had even less than he did. He'd had nights where the fridge was nearly empty, but never once had he watched his boy stand in front of a stranger and beg for food. The thought twisted his stomach in a way hunger never could. Jake looked back at his truck. He had maybe $50 left to his name, money meant to stretch until he found another odd job. Logic told him to keep it. Logic told him this wasn't his problem to solve. But logic didn't stand a chance against the image of those kids curling up in a cold car tonight, their bellies empty. He turned back to Clara. "Come with me," he said simply. She hesitated, her gaze narrowing as though she were trying to read his intentions. Trust didn't come easy to people like them. It had to be earned in small, careful steps. But in the end, she followed. That night, Jake used most of his remaining cash to rent them a small room at the same roadside motel where he and Ben were staying. The carpet was worn, the wallpaper peeling in places, but it had a real bed, a working lock, and 4 walls that could keep the night air out. He handed Clara 2 gas station sandwiches and a jug of milk he'd bought on the way. "Just sleep tonight," he told her. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to say thank you or simply accept it in silence. In the end, she only nodded, her eyes speaking more than her words ever could. Jake didn't sleep much that night either. Not because of worry, that was always there, but because something in him had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely alone in his struggle. The next morning began without ceremony, just the muted light of dawn slipping past thin motel curtains and the faint hum of a vending machine down the hall. Jake stood outside with a paper cup of motel coffee, its bitterness sharp against his tongue, and watched Clara's kids chase each other in the small patch of grass by the parking lot. Ben had joined them, his laughter mixing easily with theirs, as though they'd known each other for years instead of hours. Clara stepped out of her room a few minutes later, her hair pulled back and her jeans still creased from being folded in a thrift store bin. She looked more rested than she had the night before, but there was still a caution in her posture, like she didn't yet trust the ground under her feet. Jake made the offer without overthinking it. "If you want, I can watch them for a few hours. Might give you time to walk into town and see if anyone's hiring." She hesitated. He could see it in the way her fingers tightened around the doorframe, but then she nodded. "I'll be back before lunch." Those first mornings became a quiet routine. Clara would head toward Main Street, sometimes disappearing for hours, returning with sore feet and stories of closed doors and polite rejections. But she kept at it. On the 4th day, she came back with something different in her voice, a mix of surprise and relief. A local diner had taken her on, washing dishes and helping with tables during the lunch rush. It wasn't much, she said, but it was a start. Jake found work, too. Not steady employment, but enough odd jobs to keep the lights on. He fixed a leaning fence for an elderly man on the edge of town, cleared brush from a neglected yard, patched a leaky shed roof. The pay was small, but cash in hand meant groceries, gas, and a little less weight pressing down on his shoulders. In the afternoons, when Clara was at the diner, Jake and Ben would sometimes meet her kids at the motel picnic table with peanut butter sandwiches and cartons of chocolate milk. The 4 children, once cautious strangers, now played together until their cheeks flushed and their laughter rose above the distant hum of traffic. It wasn't a perfect life. The motel walls were thin, the money was still tight, and the future felt as fragile as glass. But for the first time in months, the days had shape. There was purpose, and somewhere in that small, slow rhythm, hope began to quietly take root. A week later, the sky was a pale, hazy blue as Jake drove Clara into town for her afternoon shift. The cab of the truck smelled faintly of coffee and engine oil, the familiar scents of his days. Ben and Clara's kids were back at the motel with a neighbor they'd come to trust, and for the first time since they'd met, it was just the 2 of them in the truck. They rode in companionable silence for a few miles, the tires humming against the asphalt. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the passenger window as the rows of weathered storefronts came into view. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, but there was a weight in her expression that made Jake glance at her twice. Then, without turning her head, she spoke. I was going to give up that night. Jake kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. I told the kids we'd try one last time, she continued, her voice even, as if she didn't want it to shake. And then you showed up. The words settled in the air between them, quiet but heavy. She wasn't talking about luck or fate or some grand rescue. She was talking about the kind of help that doesn't come with fanfare, the kind that doesn't fix everything but keeps a person going just long enough to take the next step. Jake didn't know what to say. The truth was, he hadn't done anything he thought was extraordinary. He'd simply seen someone drowning in the same storm he'd been trying to survive. And in that moment, it had felt impossible to walk away. Neither of them had become rich. Clara was still living day to day, and Jake was still chasing the next job. But something had changed. What they were building wasn't built from romance or convenience. It was built from the kind of trust that comes when two people see the worst in each other's lives and choose to stand anyway. They became a kind of family, not because they filled the empty spaces in each other, but because they gave each other the room to heal in their own time. When they reached the diner, Clara opened the door but paused before stepping out. She glanced back at him, a small, genuine smile breaking through the fatigue. Thanks for standing with me. Jake nodded, the words catching in his throat. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew. And as she walked toward the back door of the diner, Jake realized that for the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't look quite so endless.